All right. So there's the elections of 1945, right after all of the negotiations, all of the attempts to resolve the problems of the subcontinent, attempts by the British, by the Muslims, the Hindus, all of the communities, Indians in general. We've seen the results, we've seen the consequences of each attempt. May that be the Gandhi Jana talks, the Lord Wilson Conference, the cabinet mission. Okay, we'll be talking about the cabinet mission plan here, or you could say the Pakistan resolution, the Cripps mission of 1942. Now it was the time that the Congress and the Muslim League were again contesting elections here. After 1937, 1945, 46 elections were the first major elections of the subcontinent. We'd already know the results of the 37 elections. Muslim League had faced a very, very severe defeat because of certain problems with the image of the party, certain problems with the representation of the leaders. Now Muslim League had a chance to strike back again even stronger this time and obviously work on the problems they had faced previously in the 1937 elections. Here, why was Muslim League so successful in 1945 elections? Muslim League performed really well this time, and they had one major. They had won a chance to form governments in major provinces this time, and the reasons why League was so successful this time was that they had experienced the Congress tyrannical rule of 1937 to 1939. After the Congress rule, they knew that they had to do something to win the next elections because they could not afford another 2 years of Congress dominating over the Muslims there. They improved their planning, they improved their organization, they campaigned more effectively, and this is why more people knew about the party. They were aware of the agendas of Muslim League, and hence this is why this party performed really better this time. Number two, by the time they were fighting these elections, they had already passed the Lahore resolution. People were aware of the agenda. They already knew what the Muslim League was working for. You see, a similar problem was encountered in 1937. People weren't actually aware of the agendas of the party. They were confused. They didn't know what were they voting for. They didn't know what were they struggling for. So now they actually they had experienced the Pakistan resolution. They knew they knew the clear lines on which the Muslim League was struggling for. Pakistan movement was officially started by this time, and they knew that Muslim League was working for a separate homeland. People were supporting this ideology. People were really in favor of a separate country because they had been going through all of the tyrannies of Congress in the Congress rule. And I mean, other than the 37, 39 years as well, Congress had to, I mean, Congress was constantly campaigning for self-rule. They were not approving anything that demanded separate uh, homeland. Gandhi Jana talks, Gandhi did not agree with any point Jinnah conveyed in the Gandhi Jana talks because Jinnah was set on getting a separate country. And Gandhi considered himself as the only spokesman of the India, and he was working for the self-rule. He wanted the independence to be guaranteed, general independence to be guaranteed first, and then independence of the Muslims, whereas Muslims were totally against this idea. This is why people voted for Muslim League and they performed really well. Number two, the image problem was now resolved by the 1940s because obviously in 37 Muslim leaders were seen as rich landlords who cared less about the problems of the people. But now we had seen that the leaders were fighting on the front line. Jinnah had presented the law resolution. Uh, we had also seen the day of deliverance, the celebration of the day of deliverance after the 39's rule. Muslims had come together and they realized their problems. Jinnah had constantly been representing Muslims through different reforms there. May that be the Passing Resolution, the Cripps Mission, the opposition to Cripps Mission, the Gandhi Jinnah talks. He was there face to face talking to Gandhi about the problems. Now the Muslims were more, you could say, ensured that their leaders were actually working for them. Muslims now trusted their leaders more than ever before, and this is why they voted for this party. And yeah, this is why they were so successful. There could be a 7-mark question on this, guys, that why did the Muslims perform better in the 45 elections? We've studied the 3 reasons. You need to analyze each reason separately. Remember, your analysis is very important. You might not get a mark for a reason if you don't write the analysis. We've just discussed the analysis in Habiba's response right now. I hope you guys, listen to that effectively. And for this, I'll also explain a few more examples there. If we focus on this point here, that Muslim League had passed the Lahore resolution and started working for separate homeland. So if you let's say if you just pick up this one point here and try to analyze this point, the presentation of Lahore Resolution, how was it a point that contributed to the success of Muslim League? Now, this is what analysis is. Once you explain the reason, you tell that because the Lahore Resolution was presented, Muslims were more aware of the you could say the demand that they had presented in front of the British and the Indians. They knew that what they were working for, and they had their agenda very clear. Because of which Muslim League was successful in gaining the trust of the Muslims across India, and hence they were so successful. This is what an analysis is, that you explain the reason and then you explain the effect of that reason onto the course of history in the light of what the question demands. Importance of these elections now. You can also see a few questions regarding the importance for the progress of Pakistan movement here. So number one, Hindus voted for Congress and Congress demanded general independence. Muslims voted for Muslim League and Muslim League demanded creation of Pakistan. British, after this election, had realized that the two communities had completely separate demands and they cannot work together now. This was very important for the British to know that Congress and Muslim League were now working on different lines. All the years since 1906, since the formation of Muslim League, before that, and even after that, till the 1920s, after 1920s, since Khilafat movement, we've seen how Congress was somehow still convinced that they were working for Muslim cause as well. But originally they weren't, because they were all the time Hindu dominated before the establishment of Muslim League and after the establishment of Muslim League. So Congress had been a Hindu dominant since forever. So, but this thing wasn't clear to the British. Muslims knew, this is why Muslims formed Muslim League in the first place. But it was very important to tell the British about this as well. And now at this point in time, in 1945, the British, they did have a general idea about what the things were and how the things were turning out since many years. But these elections was sort of a, you could say, a very strong demarcation of what the two parties were working for, and that they had completely different ideologies, and the British finally had to do something. Similarly, after these elections, Muslim League became stronger. They were more motivated to work for the cause. They were more motivated to work for the separate homeland, and they knew that because they've struggled so much up till now, they've gained the Muslim trust, which was, I mean, which was a problem in the previous elections. They were successful in doing that, and now they had just a few more years to gaining independence. We see that is what happened till 1947 when the British finally decided to leave India. So yeah, one of the last few reforms of the by the British in the subcontinent was the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. Now British were still attempting to negotiate because obviously they had been ruling over the subcontinent for hundreds of years, and how could they immediately just decide to leave India? They were trying their best to reach a settlement. This is why they introduced another plan after the elections, the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. Cabinet Mission Plan divided India into three parts. Number one, a Muslim majority, an Indian majority, sorry, two Muslim majority areas and one Hindu majority area. Obviously, this idea was completely in line with the demands of the Muslims. Not completely, because Muslims are demanding separate country, but again, British decided to give autonomy to the Muslims. Guys, this is how you see, this is why we say that the elections of 1945-46 were so important, because Muslims were finally successful in pressurizing the British. And you see how in the same year, British had introduced a reform favoring two Muslim majority areas. This had never happened before. So this was a consequence of the struggle of the Muslims over here. And now this provincial autonomy was also approved. Jinnah accepted this cabinet mission plan because he knew that British were now protecting the Muslim rights, and Jinnah knew that once they had accepted the Muslim majority areas, it will be easier for them to work for independence after that. So it was obviously better than Hindus campaigning for this self-rule and then a situation of chaos that was there in the subcontinent. This is why Jinnah accepted the cabinet mission plan of 1946. Nehru, on the other hand, rejected the plan because he said that they wanted the British to immediately leave. So guys, here's an open question for all of you. Why do you think was Congress wanting the British to leave at this point. They didn't just reject the reforms, they didn't just ask the British to make further concessions. They simply said that the British should leave India now. Why do you think they took such a strong stance at this point in time? Question.
Because they thought that the British would side with the Muslims.
Yes, all right. Anyone else?
Because Muslims were also losing in power, and British and Muslims were together, so the Congress would face
Mm,
difficulties in future if this
yeah,
plan would be accepted. That
absolutely. Both of you are correct. So because this plan favored the Muslim agenda over here, Congress had been campaigning for self-rule, which was not obviously accepted over here. And obviously the British weren't, they didn't guarantee partition over here. They just said that Muslims can have their Muslim majority areas. Congress saw this as an opportunity for the Muslims to further pave their way to a separate country. This is why it was a threat to their agenda. And they obviously saw that the Muslims were successful in pressurizing the British, and this could mean that in future they might see more reforms favoring the Muslim side. This is why they didn't just reject the reforms, they demanded the British to leave India as of now, because Congress had seen their Congress rule. They knew that if British had left India without guaranteeing a separation, Congress still had a chance to form their own government and dominate over the Muslims. This is the opportunity that the Congress saw over here. So when Jinnah saw that the Congress had rejected these reforms and they demanded the Muslims and the British to leave, Jinnah also rejected the plan. You see, because Jinnah knew that if this plan was, let's say, accepted and the British had left, there was no way that they were getting partition, because the Congress was working on very different lines over here. They were thinking very cleverly at this point in time. They knew by rejecting this reform and by leaving, by asking the British to leave, even let's say if the reform, if the cabinet mission plan got accepted later on, they will still have an opportunity of forming a self-government over here in India, because no one was there to guarantee partition. So Jinnah knew that, okay, we don't have to accept anything less than partition now. This is why he also rejected the reforms. That was a very, very clever move by the Muslims as well. So now we were again at a deadlock. The Congress and Jinnah were, the League were demanding completely different things over here. There was obviously no cooperation between the two parties, and this is why the plan was also rejected. But it was also important. Why? Because it negotiated with both of the parties, although it was unsuccessful, but it was still an attempt from the side of the British to bring both of the parties together. And it further proved that partition was important. Direct Action Day of 1946 was the next move. In 1946, okay, so now because the major political party of India had demanded the British to leave, there were also several protests against the British now. People were the Hindus were demanding the British to leave India without a partition. Um, so sorry guys, just a second. Okay. And at this point in time, Muslims are also demanding that the British must leave, but Muslims wanted the partition to be secured before the British could leave India. There were clashes between the Hindus and Muslims during these protests. 4,000 people died because as a result of the violence in the subcontinent. And because of these protests, the violence, British had further realized that they needed an immediate action plan. 3rd June 1947, this plan was presented by the Viceroy Lord Mountbatten. He was sent to India in 1947 to negotiate with both of the political parties and see how how they'll be governing India. At this point, British had made their idea clear that they were deciding to leave India now, and but obviously they had to decide on how the future of India would be governed. So this is where Jinnah presented his demands to the new Viceroy Lord Mountbatten, And there was a 3rd June plan that was announced, and this 3rd June plan stated that there will be 2 states, India and Pakistan, and they will obviously have their own new constitutions. There will be an interim constitution. The Government of India Act would be implemented as the interim constitution until both of the countries develop their own constitutions. And this is where everybody knew that Pakistan was officially being created. And yeah, that's it. This is how the struggle came to an end, and the Pakistan movement was finally um, concluded with the demands of Muslims being met. This plan was accepted by both of the political parties over here because they knew that this was the only solution to the problems of the subcontinent. They had been negotiating for years now. If you look at the formal years of Pakistan movement, 40 to 47, they had been working on these lines for 7 years without a compromise, and the problems were obviously growing for both the political parties. British were also leaving. This is why this plan was accepted, not very open-heartedly, because we see during the partition as well, there were a lot of attacks on the Muslims. The partition was very, very difficult. You guys can even Google about the 1947 partition. You'll see how difficult it was for the Muslims to migrate to a new country, get settled over there, face the attacks by the Congress. There was no safe passage for the refugees because of the Muslims had to leave everything off and migrate to a new country. Um, a new country that was newly developed. It was obviously not in a condition to accommodate the refugees. This is why it was a problem for the Muslims now. But that is a complete different era of history that had unrolled at this point in time, and we'll study about the politics of Pakistan now from the next lecture onwards. That is the section 3 of history and culture of Pakistan. Guys, is there any question so far?
Sir, I'm gonna ask, okay, why did now Congress has to just that Congress has to oppose on Muslims and Muslim League that you have to stay here and being under our rule, because now the Viceroy also had made the decision of two states, and they knew that now the partition has to take place. But why didn't Congress is accepting this decision?
You're asking why did the Congress not oppose the 3rd June plan?
I'm asking that now the 3rd June plan was approved, and they knew the 2 states will be built, and India and Pakistan are now 2 states officially. So why now Congress has to just oppose being harsh with Muslims or with the Muslim League? And at the time of partition also, then when the refugees were moving to their country, they were attacking on them. Why do they have to do it when they knew, okay, the decision has made?
Yeah, okay. So the decision was obviously made, but it was against the demands of Congress. Yeah. And they had no other option than to accept what was going on. The political parties, they make the decisions. Congress, the leaders of the Congress, Gandhi, Nehru, they had decided to accept this plan because they knew that it was impossible for them to work with the Muslims and to have a joint administration with the Muslim League. So this is why the leaders, they had decided to accept the plan. Now the people were not happy with the decision. You see, there's one thing in democracies, what happens is that once the leaders, they accept, they present certain policies, and then it's onto the people whether to accept or reject the policies. People obviously didn't have any say as to how they wanted to, they want whether they wanted the policy, this plan to be accepted, rejected. This was what the government had to decide, and this is what the leaders of Congress did. Now the people were not happy with this because obviously they had been campaigning for a completely different plan over here, and it was the acceptance of 3rd June plan was against their agenda. They had to accept that. They had to they had to comply with what the government was planning for them, but it was a difficult decision for them to accept. And when this happens in democracies, people try to show their power through protests, through demonstrations. At times, all of this turns into violence as well by attacking the opponent communities. Muslims were obviously migrating, but their country was getting divided. This is why they were just trying to to showcase their power in every opportunity that they had, whether by attacking, by demonstrations, by protests. All right. So this was it. There was no formal, you could say, there's no formal reasoning as to why what the people were attacking on the Muslims. They were just trying to showcase their power in the limited the opportunities that they had. All right, because obviously this decision was a very difficult one for them to accept. All right. Anything else, guys? Any questions? Okay, I'll end the recording here.